Welcome to another episode. Today I'm joined by the Sprinter team. Thank you guys for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, glad to be here, man.
Awesome. So this episode is going to be slightly different. We're going to be discussing the Sprinter team's talk at Protocol Work, where they talked about competition models in solver-based protocols. And like as it always happens, some of the screenshots from the talk went viral on Twitter, and the nuance was left out. So I was like, this is the perfect time to kind of go deeper and get your take on some of these things and get your comments on how intent-based protocols are developing. So I'm very glad to have this conversation.
Yeah, same here.
Awesome. Why don't we start with the quick introduction of Sprinter as a project and, of course, like you guys.
Yeah, sounds great. Let me start out. I'm Alex. I'm working on the product side in Sprinter. Sprinter's actually quite new project. I think it's spun out or has been launched last year around that time, so 1 year old. Focused on improving cross-chain UX. So we started in the chain abstraction hype basically, and then moved a little bit more to solver infrastructure and cross-chain liquidity. But the team actually has been doing interop since 5 years at least, I think. So there's two, I would say, origins of the team. One origin is ChainSafe, blockchain consulting firm that's quite known in the space. That was what I was part of before Sprinter. We have done Interop there for 5 years, have built one of the first bridges between Ethereum and Substrate, for example, back in 2020, I think. Have built CK bridges, optimistic bridges, everything. And then, got infected by the solver-based or intent-based hype. I think, 2 years ago or something like this. And the other part of the team has actually a background more in MEV searching and solving on that side. Project Blanc that joined Sprinter, I think, around November last year. And that's also what when Nadeem joined our team. Yeah, that's from my side. Nadeem, you want to?
Yeah, maybe a quick intro of my background. So originally, I'm a mathematician. I worked in traditional finance for many years, and I switched to crypto, I think, 2018. I was part of the Celo ecosystem, the stable coins on Celo. I worked on different things like oracles, AMMs, like all these things that were not existing 5 years or 6, 7 years ago. My focus is economics and financial engineering.
Beautiful. So, of course, you had a research paper go out on solver-based protocols. So before we dive into the takeaways, why don't we set context of like what were you trying to achieve with this research?
That's a good question. I mean, at first and foremost, we solve ourselves. So we operate solvers in, for example, also the protocols that have been discussed there. So we have obviously an interest in understanding how do they operate, how is competition in there, which servers are doing good, which servers are not doing good, because, what is kind of the advantages and disadvantages that certain servers have with you can phrase this around, hey, maybe finding alpha, what is working and what's not working, and stuff like this. And maybe Nadeem, I'm not too sure about the origins of the research actually, but at least that was from my point of view what drove most of the interest in the beginning. And only then we arrived at points where we thought like, hey, that's actually might be interesting also for the wider group, especially I think because when we started discussing this with team, when we started discussing the implications of certain auction forms or certain modes of competition with the teams themselves, we realized there's a big, I would not say necessarily misunderstanding, but a big discrepancy about how we felt certain things impact and then how it was seen by other actors in the same ecosystem. So we thought like kickstarting this discussion around, hey, how does competition look like right now? What's working, what's not working, what's maybe good and bad, and where to strive for or not to strive for, is a worthwhile debate to have.
Yeah, I mean, when I started to look in the data, it was mainly understanding what other solvers are doing. And then also trying to understand where we are failing, why we are failing, where we're failing, how can we win some more market share. These are the typical questions that you have in such an environment. But this led us to basically realize like what is the state of the system.
Awesome. I mean, so it was like market research basically because you're running your own solver and you're interested in knowing like the best practices, what's working and what doesn't work, right? So I've prepared a list of like a few key takeaways that was super interesting to me, and I'm just gonna jump right into it, right? So the first one, it says solvers with access to capital and private liquidity dominate auctions across all intent-based protocols today. Now, like this is not surprising because in a way, solvers with capital should be dominating because they can like access capital easily and front capital, especially in the cross-chain context, right?
Yeah.
But I want to hear more from you guys, like what did you think about this particular takeaway? Because this was a key theme of your entire research.
Yeah, definitely. Nadeem, you want to go first? Or?
Yes, I mean, I think the premise for us was a bit, I mean, like originally I was more focusing on the single chain, like intent solving, the Crowdsourced, for example. And I mean, I kind of knew that private liquidity is important, but I somehow had the hope that like there is like some power in being smart about routing, because it's kind of like this mindset in which we were all growing up, like in this MEV mindset where someone who can build a smart algorithm can extract value. So this was like cross-chain, it was kind of clear, but like cow swap, of course, it's like there was some hope that it wouldn't be like this, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, as Nadeem said, we kind of expected it to some extent, and I mean, I'm not sure to say it. Also, already this debate, is this a good thing or bad thing, is actually worthwhile having, because when you say like, and obviously in the cross chain, and it's really different, that's also something I think that has that is that really helped us on the Sprinter side, because we have solving, or we have like teams that solve in CowSwap and do AMM solving, and then teams that solve on Across or Mayan that do cross-chain solving. And those two are actually quite different, because such a thing, that's why Across also calls the solvers just relayers, because a lot of solving isn't actually being done in terms of like route or path finding, like in the case of a swap or trade where you have to actually really find routes. So that's kind of different. But in the cross-chain case, yeah, we expected this, and we knew. I mean, we know the big solving teams, and we know which market makers perform and perform and who don't, and have also personal relationships to most of them. So we kind of saw that, and then obviously there's this economics of scale. But the question from our point of view is really, because there's always this narrative in the space of like, hey, there has to be this. Everybody can run a solver. A little bit like in Ethereum, where you say like, hey, there should be home stakers, that run a node at home or whatever. And we had the same here, and this is a point that we think is worthwhile discussing, because the argument is sometimes used, and sometimes folks say, yeah, but we have, for example, it's fine that we have those small margins because home solvers or indie solvers can still make a living with it. But at the same time, we then see that usually, like when it comes to the market share, actually the professional actors have that market share. And when you think that to the end, then that means you actually replicate a situation like you maybe have in TradFi, where you have 5 or 6 market makers that actually do all the trades, and then that's it. And I think I'm not sure if one of them approach is right or wrong. Let's say indie solvers versus professional market makers. But it's a debate worth having. And I think as a protocol specifically, you should have an idea of what is my desired state, ideally at some point, of solvers that I want to have. Am I fine with, let's say, 3 market makers owning the whole market and giving me certain guarantees, maybe in SLAs or whatever? Or do I want to put an emphasis on having certain indie solvers that actually can make a living as well, and can operate?
Well, why do you think this is happening right now? That solvers with access to more capital are dominating, right? Like this is the pure data influence, and like you said, a protocol can then design their auctions based on what they're optimizing for. So of course, there is some sort of choice as well, but at the moment, of course, solvers with the capital are dominating. So why do you think that is happening?
I think that the first thing is, solving, as we just like talked about, it's not just a logical problem. It's a question of having resources. It's a question of having access to venues, access to liquidity, infrastructure. So this is the one side. And the other side, I think our design quite often is rather naive, in the sense that we create a system where we basically govern a large part of the mechanism by competitive structures. And then we have this inherent beliefs that this competition will sort out all our problems. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like we almost have this literal free market idea, which I believe, and I think even like free market enthusiasts don't believe to that extent as we believe it in crypto sometimes. Well, as it seems that we would believe it.
So you're saying like we're basically saying that free markets will do their things, and hopefully the order flow will be distributed across a bunch of solvers, but that's not how things are working out in reality, right? Like, so there's an obvious edge for having liquidity on your balance sheet if you're solving across intent-based protocols. Like, I want to know from you guys as solvers, in your experience, what has been your experience like? Like, if you had more capital, would you be able to win more order flow, or do you think this is like this still depends on some sort of skill level, and capital is not the only thing that matters?
Yeah, but I think it's definitely, we phrased this in the talk also like this. It's actually relationships. You come from like, hey, I have the best algorithm, to actually I have the best relationships. And for us, personally, it's definitely like, it's directly a cost. In the cross-chain case, it's basically, you need inventory across chains. And if you want to solve and that's one thing. So when we talk usually about capital or liquidity-related problems and solving them, it's two things. It's capital itself. So I have assets available in my inventory, and that means not only stables, which is quite fine to have, but also volatile assets, which I would need to hedge or something like this. That means like if I want to go professionally about it, I cannot just take, I do not know, from a liquidity provider, a bunch of WEF and kind of put it into my inventory. I have to make sure that I'm protected against the market movement of the WEF price, and that means I have to hedge the positions or whatever to actually have an inventory that is more or less, I would say, and Nadeem knows the correct terms better than I do, but protected from this volatility of the assets themselves. That's one thing, that's capital. The second part of the problem is actually inventory management. That means how can I make sure that the right liquidity is on the right chain at the right point in time? And ideally, you want to have everything solved, and then not just one part of it. Because inventory management incurs costs, so you have rebalancing that usually is taking up a lot of the costs, but also like the mental load, because this is usually not fully automated. I'm not aware of a team that does this fully automated, so there is a manual component to it that gets triggered and understands where to move liquidity when, because it's not like, there's a lot of, when you look at across, for example, or others, there's a lot of peaks coming from certain, I do not know, certain narrative pushs or hypes that are coming. So it's not a super regular pattern to a certain extent. So that's the second aspect of the problem. And we definitely see, we don't solve with a lot of liquidity right now, but we face the same, I think, decision that at some point every solver then faces. Either you try to get these relationships going and actually get access to private liquidity, which is not easy. So for certain, we have spoken to big market makers or smaller market makers. It depends a little bit, obviously, on the requirements, but obviously, as you can imagine, for very big market makers, you also need a substantial volume and turnover to actually get access to the same pricing that somebody else would get. So it's not even if you say, I want private liquidity, this doesn't mean necessarily you necessarily get private liquidity, and especially not to the same terms as the teams get that are part of the market maker themselves. That's simply a different risk profile, and you can't compete on that actually.
Is there like a sweet spot in terms of inventory size that allows you to solve in a multi-chain context? Like based on your research and analysis, there are a number of solvers that are running today, right? So, and you also did some profitability research or sustainability research. So what's the sweet spot number where a solver can be confident that, okay, if I have this much inventory, I can probably be profitable?
I think I'm not sure. There is solvers that are profitable with small amounts. That they are very focused and across on USDC routes and the small fills that are, then choose very specifically where is the gas wars happening, where aren't they happening on certain chains, and then optimize it. So I think you can get profitable with little liquidity. It's just very hard. For example, our strategy has been a little bit more focused on larger solves and not smaller solves, and that obviously then comes with bigger liquidity requirements. When you look at how I like to think about it is like, because also you don't see, even if you have an across account, we also choose those protocols, which is maybe worth saying, because they have great data available online that you can actually look into. That's not, there's other protocols where you actually have very little visibility. But in those protocols, you can actually see which solvers that run long term, and you can almost assume if they run long term, then they are likely profitable, because else, there's usually just a phase of like checking it out or maybe a reputation game. But then you can actually see that when they're operating for a longer period of time, then they are likely profitable. And across that requires minimum a higher 6-digit to lower 7-digit amount. Actually, the top 3 or 4, I think, solve with minimum 2 million USD and then solve maybe 5-6 chains.
Got it. Nadeem, anything to add to this?
No, I think Alex said everything.
The other thing, all of these intent-based protocols, they're also working on like crowdsourced liquidity, right? Like you were talking about private liquidity, how solvers have to kind of go out and raise money from other liquidity sources. One of the sources is, of course, the public, right? And retail, like even I would LP funds in a lending protocol or like some sort of pool and get a yield on it. So I feel like this similar trend or design is coming towards intent-based protocols where I can lend my money to solvers and then get a rev share from their like earned yield. Do you think there's merit to this design, or like as solvers, how are you thinking about this?
I mean, there's multiple questions there on Nadeem.
No, please go, please.
Yeah, I wondered, like, for example, because it's now there's some teams working on that, as you said. And what I wondered, why didn't this start earlier? I know we have solvers now since 3 years or 4 years. Why isn't this already available? Or why isn't this not even a part of the cross-chain protocols actually themselves? Why do you have solvers that have to bring the liquidity? Why doesn't the protocol themselves do it? So that's some interesting questions. And I think it's definitely needed. I touched on those two big problems for solvers. It's capital and actually inventory management, especially when it comes to volatile assets. If you want to keep your balance sheet risk-free or low risk. So that's definitely an issue. I think why we haven't seen that before had multiple reasons. And one thing is probably, I would say, the legal environment. So because the protocols themselves, you would have to take some kind of custody probably over the funds to kind of actually be able to provide that to the solvers. I think in the early days it wasn't easily technically doable without having actually have custody, and that's why I think most of the cross-chain protocols avoided this in the first step. But it's definitely something that is helpful and is needed. The other argument why I think also some of the teams that started with it and have actually moved away from it is the margins, because at the moment, solving is a volume game, so you can definitely be profitable and stuff, but you have to go into the top 10 of solvers. And when you see our analysis, you also see that usually only 10 solvers do more than 1% of the volume. Even if you have 30 or 80 solvers, usually only 10 of them make, I would say, a reasonable volume and also revenues. And and for those solvers, definitely would matter.
Nadeem, you were saying something.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to point out something interesting in this regard, because like if you look at this whole inventory allocation and the deployment of inventory on different chains, it feels rather unnatural for something basically which should be a value transfer. And I think this is it's very much beyond the whole solving scope. It touches on our view on interoperability, because I think there are two things that we're mixing up. I mean, one thing is moving value from one chain to another versus moving a proof of ownership of a specific asset from one chain to another. Because just to give you an analog in the traditional world, you don't want to move your stocks that you own from one custody account to another. You wouldn't do that. It's a pain to do that. And it's for reasons it is a pain. If you want to move value, you are using money, because money is designed as a protocol that is meant to be easily moved from one account to another account, from one bank to another bank. And I think when we are talking about crypto assets, we should kind of have the same perspective. I mean, if I want to move ETH, for example, or Bitcoin, this is like moving a stock from one account to another. Or it is moving a synthetic representation of this value. And these kind of movements, they need inventory on both sides, because they are complicated transactions. They are not just a transfer of value, but they are a transfer of much more. And I think this is important to kind of keep in mind when from an interop design perspective when we're thinking about these things.
I mean, in my mind, I like to think of chains as different markets, right? So you're basically moving your currency across different markets to access something new. So like you said, you're also not only just moving value across chains, you're moving value to do something in a new ecosystem, and that ecosystem has different risks. So the solvers who are actually enabling this would have a different risk profile for all of these assets on their inventories. So I mean, it's a thankless job in a way as a solver to kind of manage risks. But how do you guys think about that? Because do you just mark it all down as one asset, one risk profile, or do you actually consider all the different chain profiles, all the different synthetic versions, and then do a proper analysis of this?
I mean, yes, we do, and I mean, and also when you are thinking about liquidity provision and everything, I mean, there's an interesting side that if you think about providing liquidity for solving a cross-chain intent, it very much moves from the question how reliable is the borrower to how reliable is the route that I'm lending the liquidity for. So it's a very interesting kind of shift.
Yeah, we definitely have to, and that's both in the sense of scoring and trying to understand, for example, if you have to price that risk, in the forms of a score or a weight for an interest rate, then you would definitely look at the chains and stuff. And also we see, I mean, a lot of success in the alt ones with Hyperliquid, or you can maybe look at Solana as an older example, but that's definitely a consideration where we definitely always think hey, how high is the risk of that chain rocking or reorging and stuff like this. Yeah, that's definitely something you have to take into consideration. So the ETH space with its L2s, they are quite, quite home. But yeah, especially with a lot of the newer chains coming up with own L1s or like vertically integrated and having app and chain, then this will get more exciting for sure in pricing that appropriately.
Okay. Another takeaway that I want to mention is definitely the fact that a handful of solvers have most of the rewards and also the volume, right? Like I think you mentioned in Crowdsourced, 3 solvers account for over 50% of all the volume. And among the top 3 solvers, one stands out as an outlier, capturing nearly 50% of all rewards. So it's definitely like very dominated, like very top heavy, which is not surprising because even if you look at any protocols like volume sources, that's how it works out. Like the top is always heavy, but then the number is much greater than like 3 or 5 or 10. I mean, like how should people look at this sort of dynamic? Because this is not changing. Like I was telling you guys off the recording that last year when we did this research, the numbers looked very similar. And a year down the line, even though the number of solvers participating in an auction have increased, but the order flow is not distributed any differently. It's still top heavy.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on, and that's why I think, like, I mean, I'm a product guy, so I like to think in terms of personas and types of users, and I think this is helpful to think about what you want to look at. When you look at this, at Cow, for example, as you mentioned, and you have this top solver that, by the way, isn't solving anymore since June, but so shortly after we stopped, we stopped basically the analytics, but yeah, that solver definitely like has advantages, has private liquidity, and it's also amplifying because there is no risk of AMM on-chain liquidity usage in terms of like reverts or volatility or the price in the pools moving against you. So it has a very, very tight pricing and at the same time, basically has a very low risk of failures or settlement failures. But at the end, and the top solver is a market maker, the question is like, what is their main reason to do that? And my impression was from speaking with them is that it was still an experimental stage for most of them, and not something like that they thought like, hey, we as a market maker, our prime business should be in cross-chain solving. That market is quite small still, I mean, it's growing, but when you look, it's maybe 100 million in annual revenue, I would estimate, but that's the market, and that's obviously for a market maker quite small. But they had, and back to that capital problem that we mentioned, they have the inventory management available, they have the capital on all the chains available. So it was kind of, I think, a natural step to try out and see what you can actually, how is solving, and basically inspect it as maybe new revenue stream for the future or a new business to engage in. And I think that was the state what we have seen over the last 2 years. And that's the state most market makers are in. And some will probably stay and some will probably go away and focus on their core business.
I mean, so if I understand you correctly, you're saying the volumes are still pretty low for more and more solvers or market makers to kind of come in and solve for this market.
Yeah.
I mean, it's guessing, but our assumption is that at the moment it's not lucrative enough to justify more investment. And we also know from some of the market making teams that are top 5 in some of the protocols that their operation is not profitable because they are not one team operation. When they set up a solving team, then that's 3 to 5 people minimum. And that has a different price tag, obviously, and especially the opportunity cost. What could those 5 people then do if they wouldn't work in cross-chain solving? And that's quite a hefty price tag. And I haven't yet met a market maker solving that says like, hey, yeah, that's like, we will move our whole business to cross-chain solving. More like that it's a kind of addition to the portfolio and something that should be done.
Well, isn't that kind of like scary for the whole intent-based paradigm? Because if I look at it from a trend and adoption perspective, the numbers do look promising. Like intent-based bridges are getting more and more order flow. If you look at the DEXs, the intent-based designs are getting more of the market share. But when I talk to like solvers and market makers, the perception has still not changed, or the revenue side of things, the business side of things has not changed, and the whole intent market landscape depends on market makers and solvers, right? So it's like you're singing a different song from 2 different sides.
Yes, I mean, I think it's kind of like the perspective has to change because I believe it comes very much from these early days of cowboy MEV, where you had the chances to earn a lot in a very short time in this competitive market. And I strongly believe, and I'm convinced that we need to change our mindset here. We need to have much more of a service provider mindset where we consider the solvers to be a service provider, an intermediary that is doing something for us in a controlled environment, rather than like a cowboy that is trying to extract the maximum value. I think this is not helping. And with that in mind, we also have then to design our systems. We have to design systems that are robust in the sense that we want to have a certain amount of solvers that can survive from, or like, I don't mean like a full company, but like this operation should be like profitable. It should be a diversity of solvers, and we should really look at all the different services that are part of solving, and we should be much more careful with using competition as a mechanism for all of those. I think you should be much more careful to be, okay, this is part of the mechanism that I want to govern via a competition design. And this part, actually, I want to have it more like a service design.
So there's multiple ways to think about this. So Nadeem touched now on this one aspect of like, hey, where should competition actually take place or not? Another area is obviously efficiency, I would say. We touch on quite some measures in the talk that we think are worthwhile pursuing and that we see also some teams are already taking. Some is shared infrastructure, that means like, how can we improve the situation? We bring the costs of the servers down, the operational costs, and how can we do that? We share liquidity, we reduce duplicated efforts. At the moment, every solving team is basically fighting on their own. There's so much duplicated efforts in terms of integrating liquidity sources and stuff like this, that there could be a lot. There's a lot of potential in teams like Propeller, for example, with Tycho. They try to go that avenue already and say, okay, let's try to build some shared infrastructure to actually make solving simply more efficient. And that's actually then margin that can be distributed one way or the other. And this other aspect is definitely at the moment, and I always like to cite this as this as an instance of this three-body problem of crypto, because it's actually a thing that should be governed not by the application. It means not a cross-cow or a protocol can solve this, but you actually have probably to solve this on a higher level, on either the Ethereum ecosystem level or even on an industry-wide level. That's why some of the TradFi approaches, let's see if we can or should adopt them, because they would require that there is this central body that can coordinate actually. Because here we have a price. We have usually all the protocols are in competition with each other, and then obviously they prioritize. In a lot of cases, they have to prioritize user welfare. And they have to execute this playbook of like, hey, let's try to be the fastest and the cheapest protocol for a while. Let's try to capture market share, and then at some point we might think about a more sustainable setup and maybe redistributing rewards a little bit differently. But what also is one of the main points that we wanted to make, that it's something you have at some point to think about a more sustainable or a sustainable setup that can live without incentives, or that doesn't just prioritize user welfare in the sense of like doing pure price competition and whoever has the cheapest price will win, but more think about how can you be more smart? Because what also comes from our facts is it isn't necessarily too little reward. There's this famous, I won't say famous, but there's this paper by Tarun Chida and some others about the intent-based markets. And actually they come to the conclusion that, hey, probably a number of 5 to 9 and an oligopoly is the best what you can get. And this is what it will end up with. And I'm more or less in the same camp. I think you will have maybe maximum of 10 solvers. But what you can be more smart about is how you actually distribute the revenue. Because right now, as we have mentioned, it's super top-heavy. And you could, for example, like in Across or in Cow, we mentioned this model of like role separation, that we say like, hey, you actually think of like, hey, solving is not one thing, but it's actually 3 services. It's quoting, it's actually routing, that means finding the route to execute, and then it's actually the execution themselves. And you can actually, for those 3 distinct stages, you can actually have different reward models or competition models for them. So you can, for example, say, quoting, you can use oracles or a standardized way that you force everybody to quote, and then it's not really something that you can differentiate with or do competition. So you can do just like, I do not know, a service, like Nadeem mentioned before, like a service provider-based approach here, and can say like, hey, then we treat quoting not as something where you have price competition, but there is every solver that is eligible, that has a certain score or whatever, gets his share of like quotes that he can do, and by that he can earn basically a minimum income already. And the same on the execution side. And you would maybe then keep the pure the price competition to the route finding itself, and by that you can actually steer as a protocol and can say like, hey, I can actually make sure 1/3 of the overall rewards is distributed quite evenly, and only 1/3 is actually distributed in the sense of like competition, where it's on the route finding. And I think that's it. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's too little revenue that's being made. I would first start with also realizing that it will be hard to increase the margins in a competitive market, but I think I would start with like being smart about how to distribute it.
Yes, and I mean, and distributing is one thing, and also how to distribute the brain power that is involved behind, because we have, let's say, 20 teams on Cow, and all these teams are creating their own routing algorithm. All these teams are creating their own adapters for the different systems. The question is, does this really make sense? I mean, it is a very repetitive work, and plus it creates a system where that puts even more pressure on the teams, and that this creates this top-heavy structure even more. And I mean, I could imagine a setup where there is like a shared infrastructure on that side as well. This infrastructure provides a base quote, and whenever a solver is able to report above the base quote, then there is a premium for this effort. But let's first make sure that there is a baseline that is available to everyone for solving, and then everything beyond that is rewarded.
I mean, so there were efforts in this direction, right? Like the ERC 7683 is in the same vein, like to create the shared infrastructure. I'm curious, like if that has taken any sort of like shape, because there was a lot of talk about it 6 months from now, but like for the last 3 months, I don't think I've heard too much about it.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, we feel the same. I mean, I think it has to be part of. I think like I would say 7683 in the context of maybe the open intents framework and everything, like a little bit beyond like just the cross-chain messaging, but yeah, looking to settlement and maybe even like liquidity index and sourcing as well. I still think, or I think there is value to that, but I think it faces the tragedy of the commons problem that a lot of such projects face. I mean, I heard you guys are also now engaging in or have been engaging in the OEF and stuff like this, and it matters on engagement. Not necessarily like. Not necessarily so much. I think this is a reflection if it's good or bad. But if you don't have strong collaborators that put in effort and that actually use it in production in a setup that actually produces reasonable revenue to actually that can be reinvested then in the open source frameworks and infrastructure, it's simply tough. And I think the open intent framework hasn't yet reached that stage, but it's only also half a year old, and such protocols take time to build. And even like, I mean, we know quite some teams that are approaching the intent-based designs via the OEF, but none of them have launched yet. So I really hope it's the future. I also think, and I think the guys did it on the OEF side quite well and tried to get the Ethereum stamp for it. I think that's why we also mentioned before a little bit that it's like I think it's an ecosystem type problem. And if you want to treat solvers as a part of interop, you also need ecosystem support and engagement to kind of say like, hey, these problems, especially the problems that are hard to solve as an individual protocol, because you have to actually act against your own interests of competitiveness. There needs to be the Ethereum Foundation or somebody stepping up and saying like, hey, we think this is the right approach for interop to go. So we help you to push that through because we know you are all competing with each other and it will be hard for you to kind of give up on certain things and say, for example, hey, there's the solver UPI or whatever, There's, I think in such situations, I think more support also from the EF could really help.
Yeah, I mean, on the OIF, I think it's still pretty early. Like, Li-Fi is contributing to it because we launched the whole Li-Fi 2.0 with the Li-Fi intent system. So we've kind of collaborated our efforts with the OIF and like building a compatible system. And I know you guys are also in touch with our product team. So hopefully that can like change a few things. But talking about like recent developments in this space, I want to talk about like a few market moves by I wouldn't say competitive, but like by all the different interop protocols in the ecosystem, and get your take on it, right? So Stargate recently, Stargate DAO allocated 20 million of their treasury to Stargate funded solvers, and we've been talking about this, like how the protocols kind of need to work hand in hand with the solvers and give them the resources and the incentive to fill. So do you think this is a move in the right direction?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I didn't know about this before you kind of pointed us towards it, so I had to check it this morning. But I think it's interesting. I mean, right now, I think what I have read is like a very early post, so it's hard to kind of understand fully the implications of it. But if the foundation is to provide liquidity, and they have, I think, a lot of protocol-owned liquidity that is available in the protocol, then that's definitely a plus. I mean, we touched on this a little bit in the beginning here of the session where we said, like, yeah, it's surprising that not more projects or protocols tackled this and actually they solve the problem because they have the distribution. They have usually, they also have more brand power usually to get liquidity providers on board. So I think from that point of view, it's definitely great. What I would be interested in personally as a solver is like those questions that were mentioned in the blog or in the forum post as well, in terms of like, is this who will solve? Is this like a permissionless system? Is there external solvers? Is this at the moment or in the beginning mainly the Stargate team or the foundation solving themselves? What is this capital? They mentioned USDC and ETH, but there's a lot more other tokens to fill. So what is with those tokens? Then is this only a loan, or is this actually liquidity that you can tap into on any chain? So the inventory management is actually kind of handled for you. So it's a lot of more detailed questions around that I hope and we are super curious to learn more about. But definitely an interesting move. And what is personally for me also like nice to see is that we also see Stargate now going the intent-based direction, because a lot of there was, especially on crypto Twitter, a lot of discussions around one-to-one burn and mint asset transfers versus intent-based system, and it's never the question of one or the other. You need, when you want to kind of like Stargate, I assume has the ambition to actually cover all of interop, then you cannot go without that. It's not actually the question one or the other, but you actually need, they both have their use cases and applications, and you might want to have both if you want to cover the majority of use cases.
I mean, this is really an important point. I mean, I touched on it before. It's really the question about, like, what do you want to build? Do you want to build, like, a real value transfer protocol? And it doesn't make sense to build such a thing with a token like Wrapped Ethereum. It doesn't make sense. I mean, you need a token that is built for this kind of service. It's not built for that. Or if you want to move synthetic ownership from one chain to another. And I think we really have to separate these two problems. And one of them needs liquidity and the other one doesn't.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, with the other one, you can just mint as much as you want. Yes. So it's like a different thing. What's good with the Stargate's approach, I guess, is they have the OFT design as well as now the intent. So I feel like it's a move in the right direction. There are still way too many questions because this was just published on Friday. But I feel like it's better than going down the route of them announcing, okay, we're going to run our own solver. And because we have a large treasury, we're just going to fund it ourselves and win all the order flow.
Yeah, totally.
And the next one I want to talk about is Across Prime. So they have this bonded bridging model introduced with V4. I don't think it's live yet, but they've proposed this where the solver basically gets the payment on the source chain immediately from the users instead of having to wait for the whole settlement process. So this basically removes the entire time period where they would have to wait and go through the whole Oracle system and then get paid on the source chain. So it's more capital efficient for these solvers.
Yeah, exactly. So at the moment, that's definitely one of our the bigger challenges in Across is definitely to handle that repayment interval, which is currently, I think, 2 hours more or less, and that definitely sets quite a tough limit on your capital utilization. So that's definitely great to hear and see that that's coming. Also here, the questions is mostly around the detail. On first, of course, if you bond it, it's another gate that you put. Across has been quite permissionless before, so now you actually have a gate, and Cow has a bond since I think since the beginning, also quite substantial bond. Yes. So that's one thing, so that means, again, when you have this, I mentioned before, the top solvers, top 5, they have at least higher 6-digit amounts of inventory. If you want to utilize it fully, then you need the same amount of bond. Then obviously the amount that is bonded cannot be used in solving, so you need actually additional liquidity, or you directly reduce your inventory size by doing that. And then also here, the main questions, or what we are looking forward to is then improvements, actually don't having to put a bond per source chain, but having more a little bit, I think, also this reminds me a little bit of the Circle Gateway that has been announced, where you actually deposit the USDC in one chain, and it doesn't matter where, and then you can actually mint it on any supported destination chain instantly. And a little bit like this, I think, could be a target for this as well, that you can actually just have the bond on one chain, and you can actually then access the liquidity on any other supported chain, right? Because I think in the first version you have to do then that bond per chain. And then it's again the question how to manage this, but when you realize, this chain actually doesn't have a lot of volume anymore, so I would have to reduce the bond and actually move it somewhere else because I want to have a higher bond there. So it's then again a question of, I think, part of the inventory management kind of this bond.
I'm also curious to get your take on the resource lock design, right? So again, it's another optimization on the intent-based design where solvers don't have to face the source chain finality risk, and they're guaranteed to get paid on the source chain, right? So I'm curious if you've thought about that and if that actually makes any meaningful difference to your lives or not.
That's a good question. Actually pinged Greg, our resource log and more user face citing expert this morning, and asked him about resource logs and testing. I'm not a resource logs expert by any means. From a solver point of view, I mean, there was, and there's, I think, escrow and account-based resource logs, escrow-based resource logs. We kind of had them escrow, like across an escrow-based deposit or prime, is not so much different from that, at least from a solver point of view. From the user side and the convenience, it's obviously different. But I think the main difference for solver, if I interpret this correctly, is that the finality risk doesn't sit with the solver anymore. So the finality risk sits then actually with the lock provider. So this would be One Balance or whoever operates the resource lock infrastructure, and we wouldn't have to take on that the finality risk. Is this a consideration of for example, we also have to prioritize a roadmap or an opportunity list of, hey, which protocols do we want to solve for? Where do we see opportunity? Why not? I'm not sure so much if this would make a difference in terms of judging one protocol over the other, if the finality risk is taken by the resource lock over us. It's more like that we bet on resource locks, I think, as part of this whole embedded wallets, more convenient UX journeys, and we more think that's the right strategic direction that will succeed midterm, like smart wallets and stuff like this. So that's why we kind of are interested in solving for resource lock based protocols, but that's more like from a business opportunity point of view, and not so much like from this risk consideration side.
Makes sense.
So,
I guess.
Nadeem, do you have some thoughts on resource locks? Or?
Yeah, I mean, but more from a design perspective, because for me, as a financial engineer, they feel rather like a crutch to something, which I believe should be more a design where the token contract itself should have this capability. So I mean, just fantasizing here, something where basically if you do a transfer of a specific token, then this token gets frozen in the account of the user, rather than having an additional contract. I think we should have a contract that has states that can be, for example, frozen while pending, and that can be unlocked. But I have the feeling it shouldn't be an additional contract, but it should be part of the token design.
Like at the token contract level.
Yes.
I mean, that would require protocol level changes, and that never happens. So.
Yes, but I think I really think the token standard is not it needs to evolve to allow this, and otherwise we will always have these kind of add-on construction like scaffolding to make it work.
Yeah, I guess it sounds like we're always trying to find a way around some of these slow moving parts, and then maybe 5-6 years down the line there would be token contract level changes, and we're like, okay, this just works now.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's also a question of how you want to do it. And it's I think one aspect of this. I think you're totally right. But one aspect of this is I think what I mentioned, there is not necessarily somebody who wants this central arbiter and wants to say this is the new token standard and how should go. And then there is a point to having some experimentation for a while. Having some experimentation of different resource locks systems, and then after, as you said, after some years, say hey, let's now bring the succeeded effort or the best approach into the protocol. I'm not sure if you can really work around that, unfortunately. But,
Correct. So if I understand your take on resource logs correctly, it's a nice to have feature, like not having source chain finality risk, but it's more of a business bet on the account abstraction level, or the account level UX changes and the embedded wallet market.
yes, so we are definitely very excited for One Balance and the other teams building in that space for sure. But and for UX, this will be a huge thing.
Awesome. Those are all of my questions. Thanks a lot for your research. I feel like that was some of the best research on solvers and solver dynamics since probably Tarun Chitra and the team's paper 1 year ago. So thank you so much for doing all of the work behind the scenes to make this research possible, and we'll make sure to link it on all of the links of this episode.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Arjun.